On a cold afternoon at the Mount in Lenox, Massachusetts, on 26th August 1908, the light slants low across the long drawing room on the hill above Laurel Lake. The house at 2 Plunkett Street, designed by Edith Wharton in 1902 and later called by Henry James, a delicate French chateau mirrored in a Massachusetts pond, feels perfectly composed from door to terrace. A letter bearing that day lies open on a polished table, a plea to the foreign correspondent W. Morton Fullerton, written on paper, headed simply, "The Mount." Wharton pauses beside one of the paired armchairs she has placed with mathematical care and nudges its back an inch into line. The small, automatic adjustment of a woman who once wrote that proportion was the good breeding of architecture and symmetry, the sanity of decoration. Beyond the tall windows, snow-dusted lawns fall away toward other estates on the Berkshires ridge. Inside, everything answers to her rules of order. On the page, her own life does not. The room is ready for guests. The letter waits for a man who will not come. The chair stands straight. Something else is starting to tilt. On 29th April 1885, in the Trinity Chapel complex on West 25th Street in Manhattan, Edith Newbold Jones, 23, married Edward Robbins Teddy Wharton, 35, a Bostonian sportsman with good horses, good manners, and no real interest in her manuscripts. The official record lists a conventional union within their class. The diary fragments and later letters suggest something quieter. A woman choosing what seems the least worst available path out of her parents' constricting house. The marriage took place against the backdrop of New York's Gilded Age society, where marriages among the old money families were transactions as much as romances. Edith Jones came from a distinguished New York family. Her father, George Frederick Jones, was a gentleman of leisure whose wealth came from real estate. The phrase, "keeping up with the Joneses," allegedly originated with her family's social prominence. She had been informally engaged once before to Harry Stevens, but his mother had broken off the engagement, citing concerns about Edith's suitability. Teddy Wharton was 12 years older, Harvard-educated but without a profession, living comfortably on a trust fund established by his family. He was affable, sociable, and athletic, a man who loved hunting, fishing, and dogs. What he was not was intellectual. He showed no interest in literature, art, or the life of the mind that Edith was already pursuing through her early writing attempts and voracious reading. Early letters to her mentor, Anna Ballman, hint at mismatch, a husband who loves travel and dogs and society, but not the sustained intellectual solitude that fuels her work. Ballman had been Edith's childhood governess and remained a lifelong friend and correspondent. The letters preserved in various archives show Edith's careful navigation between expressing discontent and maintaining the appearance of a proper marriage. The archival trail here is clean. Marriage index entries, Newport and New York addresses in city directories, annotations in her early notebooks about decorating Pencraig Cottage, and then Land's End with Ogden Codman, Jr., experiments in proportion that would culminate at the Mount. Already the pattern forms, a public role as elegant hostess, a private discipline at the desk. The decorating projects were significant. At Pencraig Cottage, a Newport rental, and later at Land's End, the house she and Teddy purchased in Newport in 1893, Edith began working with architect and decorator Ogden Codman, Jr. Their collaboration would result in the 1897 publication of The Decoration of Houses, a treatise that rejected Victorian excess in favor of classical proportion and restraint. The intelligence file would phrase it differently. A legend established, cover accepted by the environment, operational doubts unvoiced. The marriage certificate looked complete. The letters would later read like redacted pages. By the late 1890s, Edith Wharton was living between Land's End in Newport and a Park Avenue apartment in New York, testing ideas that would soon harden into architecture. In 1897, she published The Decoration of Houses with Ogden Codman, Jr., arguing against Victorian clutter and for rooms governed by proportion, balance, and disciplined sightlines. The book was revolutionary for its time. Victorian interiors had favored heavy drapery, crowded furniture arrangements, patterned wallpapers, and layers of decorative objects. Wharton and Codman advocated for something entirely different: rooms organized around classical principles with clear sight lines, symmetrical arrangements, and restrained ornamentation. Proportion is the good breeding of architecture, she writes, a line that will later circulate in design manuals and, a century on, in online quote collections. The principle extended beyond mere aesthetics. Wharton understood that physical space shaped social interaction. The placement of chairs determined who could converse comfortably with whom. The arrangement of rooms controlled circulation patterns and created hierarchies of access. Decoration was not superficial. It was a system of social management encoded in plaster and paint. Account books and correspondence from these years show payments to Codman, purchases of French and Italian prints, and careful notes on wall colors and chair placement. She is, in effect, training to build a stage. The documents reveal her meticulous attention to detail, specific measurements for picture rails, notes on paint mixing to achieve particular shades of white, diagrams showing furniture arrangements. Teddy, increasingly prone to periods of low mood and nerves, appears in these documents on the margins, listed on travel itineraries, noted in kennel bills, almost absent from the design decisions her name signs. The term nerves was the era's euphemism for what we would now recognize as mental illness. Teddy's condition would later be diagnosed more specifically, but in the 1890s it manifested as mood swings, periods of lethargy, and occasional outbursts that Edith learned to navigate around. Their marriage settled into a pattern of extended European travel, summers in Newport, winters in New York. Teddy managed their finances and organized their movements. Edith wrote and decorated. They maintained separate bedrooms, a common arrangement among their class, but one that reflected the emotional distance growing between them. Each new room she arranges is a rehearsal for a larger structure where decor will be a language and silence part of the script. The houses she worked on in this period, Pencraig Cottage, Land's End, the New York apartment, all served as laboratories for ideas about spatial control and aesthetic discipline that would reach their fullest expression at the Mount. Before she built the Mount, she had already built the grammar that would make it speak. In 1901-1902, on a slope above Laurel Lake in Lenox, Massachusetts, construction records and architect correspondence track the rise of a stuccoed, white-trimmed house, the Mount. Wharton works with architect Francis L. V. Hoppin and again with Codman, adapting English models like Belton House and classical Italian and French precedents to produce a rigorously symmetrical facade. The choice of Lenox was deliberate. The town had become a fashionable Berkshire resort, with numerous wealthy families building summer estates along the ridge above the Housatonic Valley. The Whartons had been renting in the area and decided to purchase 113 acres of land to build their own house. Edith took the lead in the project, hiring architects and making most design decisions, while Teddy focused on practical matters like land surveys and construction supervision. Francis Hoppin was a Newport architect known for Beaux-Arts designs. His collaboration with Wharton on the Mount's exterior created a structure that balanced grandeur with restraint, impressive without being ostentatious, classical without being derivative. The house drew on Italian villa traditions with a symmetrical H-shaped plan, stucco walls, and a prominent entrance courtyard. A published house museum guide today calls it a wood and stucco manifestation of Wharton's design principles, an autobiographical house where her theory became plaster, window, and stair. The assessment is accurate. The Mount embodied the principles laid out in the decoration of houses: classical proportion, axial organization, rooms scaled for human use, decoration integrated with architecture. The floor plans show a formal enfilade on the main floor, an arched gallery leading to dining room and drawing room, aligned axes in which conversation, glances, and status can move as predictably as light. The enfilade, a sequence of rooms aligned so doorways create a continuous sightline, was a device borrowed from French palace architecture. At the Mount, it allowed Edith to see from one end of the house to the other, monitoring circulation and controlling the social choreography of dinners and gatherings. In the surviving photographs, chairs are placed in matched pairs, sofas anchored under mirrored panels, a fireplace balancing French doors that open to a terrace. Every element follows geometric logic. The drawing room, the house's social heart, exemplified this approach. 18 feet by 40 feet with windows on 3 sides providing views to the gardens and lake. Furniture was arranged to create conversation groups while maintaining visual balance. The color scheme, white walls, green silk upholstery, gilt accents, was carefully calculated to provide harmony without monotony. This is the visible cover, a serene country retreat for a celebrated author and her husband. Edith had already published her first novel, The Valley of Decision, in 1902 to critical acclaim. She was establishing herself as a serious writer, and the Mount would provide both a workspace for her writing and a stage for her social performance as a literary hostess. The operational note would be blunter. Primary theater established. All entries and exits can now be controlled. When the scaffolding came down in 1902, the house already knew more about her than her husband did. By 1903, visitor accounts in Wharton's own correspondence show the Mount in full operation as both writer's retreat and social set piece. She drafts The House of Mirth here, published in 1905, dissecting New York marriage markets while presiding over dinners and musicals in the long drawing room, whose symmetry she has tuned like a sentence. The House of Mirth would become her first major commercial and critical success, selling 140,000 copies in its first 3 months. The novel told the story of Lily Bart, a beautiful but unmarried woman navigating New York society's marriage market, ultimately destroyed by the system she tried to manipulate. The irony of writing this critique while living at the Mount, a house that represented social success, was not lost on contemporary readers. Guests include Henry James, who famously described the house as a delicate French chateau mirrored in a Massachusetts pond, as well as figures like President Theodore Roosevelt, diplomat Walter Berry, and wealthy Berkshire neighbors. The guest lists survive in letters and diaries. Henry James was perhaps Edith's closest intellectual friend, a writer she admired and who recognized her talents. His visits to the Mount were frequent and extended, sometimes lasting weeks. Their correspondence shows deep mutual affection and intellectual rapport. Theodore Roosevelt's visit in 1904 was documented in newspapers and in Edith's letters. The president arrived by automobile, toured the gardens, and discussed literature and politics with his hosts. The visit validated the Mount's status as a cultural and social destination, not merely a minor summer retreat. Walter Berry, a lawyer and diplomat whom Edith had known since childhood, was another frequent guest. Some biographers have speculated about a romantic attachment between them, though the evidence remains ambiguous. What is clear is that Berry was an important intellectual companion and advisor throughout her life. The drawing room photographs from this period show chairs angled not quite toward the fireplace, but toward one another, encouraging conversation Wharton can orchestrate from a central sofa. The arrangement wasn't accidental. Each chair's position had been calculated to facilitate certain conversations while making others more difficult. Guests found themselves naturally drawn into the configurations Edith had designed, experiencing social interaction as she intended it. Each evening, servants' record logs of fires laid, lamps cleaned, and chairs moved back into exact position before guests arrive. The household staff at the Mount numbered roughly 10 during the summer season: a butler, housekeeper, cook, maids, gardeners, and coachman. Their work was documented in account books and household records that tracked every detail of daily operations: coal consumption, lamp oil, food purchases, laundry schedules. The room performs ease. The logbooks record the labor that maintains it. When she walks in last to see that everything is straight, as later visitors recall docents saying, she often makes the same small gesture: a hand on the back of a chair, nudging it until it answers the line of the room. The gesture was noticed. Multiple guests mentioned in letters and memoirs Edith's habit of adjusting furniture, straightening pillows, moving objects millimeters to achieve what only she could see as proper alignment. It was both an aesthetic compulsion and a form of control, a way of imposing order on a social environment that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. In the account books, it's just parlor chairs adjusted. In her fiction, it becomes the choreography of survival. By the late 1900s, biographers and medical historians agree that Teddy Wharton's mental health deteriorated sharply. Records speak of chronic depression, nerves, and what later commentators identify as likely bipolar illness, with bouts of spending and sudden rages that leave their marks in bank statements and family letters. The deterioration became impossible to ignore around 1905-1906. Teddy experienced periods of manic energy during which he made impulsive financial decisions, followed by deep depressions where he could barely function. He became increasingly volatile, prone to angry outbursts over minor provocations. The condition put enormous strain on the marriage and on household management at the Mount. A CliffsNotes biography summarizes the marriage as not emotionally satisfying for Edith, noting his lack of intellectual interests and her growing sense of entrapment. The understatement is characteristic of how biographical sources have handled this period. The reality was likely more painful. A woman in her mid-40s, at the height of her creative powers, trapped in a marriage to a man whose mental illness was destroying both his personality and their partnership. At the Mount, staff recollections preserved in oral histories mention atmospheres in the house, days when the master's temper and the mistress's silence made the symmetrical rooms feel tense. Servants noticed when Mr. Wharton was having one of his bad days. The household would become quieter, movements more careful. Edith would withdraw to her study or the gardens, meals might be taken separately. The usual routines would be disrupted by the need to accommodate Teddy's condition. She writes Ethan Frome in these years, a novella of suffocation and failed escape set in a New England snowfield, drafted while she looks out across Laurel Lake from her study. The connection between the story and her own life was clear to those who knew her situation. Ethan Frome tells of a man trapped in a loveless marriage to a hypochondriacal wife who falls in love with another woman but cannot escape. The attempted escape, a suicide pact via sledding accident, fails, leaving all three characters alive but paralyzed, bound together in mutual suffering. The novella's bleakness shocked many readers. It seemed at odds with the elegant, composed woman who wrote it from her beautiful house. But those who understood saw it as a kind of emotional autobiography, a way of expressing feelings that couldn't be spoken directly. Each night, the drawing room is restored to its ideal balance, sofa-centered, chairs squared, lamps equidistant. The house ledger for coal and candles shows increasing costs. Emotional expenditures, as always, go unrecorded. The financial documents from this period show rising expenses across all categories. The Mount was expensive to maintain, and Teddy's erratic behavior sometimes included impulsive purchases that strained their budget. The intelligence lens notes an emerging target, not a person to be eliminated, but a structure, the marriage, to be surveilled, tested, and eventually abandoned. The more carefully she straightened the chairs, the more crooked the marriage looked on the page. In 1907, the visitor register at the Mount records the arrival of W. Morton Fullerton, foreign correspondent for the Times, carrying a letter of introduction from Henry James. James had been a frequent guest. Yale's collection of his letters to Wharton during 1915 shows the intensity of their intellectual friendship and his awareness of the house as her projection of self. Fullerton was 42 when he arrived at the Mount, a sophisticated American expatriate based in Paris who moved in literary and diplomatic circles. He had been educated at Harvard, where he had known James's brother William. He was charming, cultured, bisexual, and notoriously unreliable in his romantic attachments. He had affairs with both men and women, often simultaneously, and left a trail of emotional wreckage behind him. Henry James knew all this when he sent Fullerton to meet Edith. Whether he anticipated the consequences is unclear. The surviving correspondence suggests James may have thought a flirtation would be harmless, even beneficial, a way for his friend to experience some of the passion her marriage lacked. If so, he badly miscalculated. Fullerton appears in this documentary chain first as a name, in James's handwriting, in Wharton's guest lists, and then as the subject of an entirely different archive, love letters and a secret diary. The visitor register at the Mount, preserved at the Edith Wharton restoration, shows his signature alongside other guests from that summer. It's a mundane record, giving no hint of what would follow. By the summer of 1907, according to later scholarship in the diary Wharton would call the life apart, the emotional operation had shifted. The diary, discovered after her death and held at Yale's Bionecca Library, documents her affair with Fullerton in coded language and emotional intensity that contrasts sharply with the controlled prose of her published work. She quotes Dante, Browning, and other poets to express feelings she couldn't articulate directly. The drawing room still hosts respectable teas and dinners, but the real traffic is in letters crossing the Atlantic, carried in diplomatic pouches of the postal system. The correspondence between Wharton and Fullerton during 1907-1910 was extensive. Dozens of letters, many surviving in archives at Yale, the University of Texas, and elsewhere. The letters show Edith's growing emotional attachment and Fullerton's more ambivalent response. In one surviving note from this period, James teases her about driving Fullerton through the Berkshire roads. The tone is lightly conspiratorial, the subtext visible only to those who know what will follow. James's letter, preserved at Yale, mentions the charming motor runs and expresses hope that his friends are enjoying each other's company. Reading it now, knowing what came next, the innocence feels almost painful. In the evening, when the guests have gone, she comes back to the drawing room, sets a single chair askew to face the terrace, and sits down alone to write. The room that once staged her marriage is starting to record its undoing. The guest book shows only another visitor. The diary in her desk marks the arrival of a new axis around which the house will turn. On 26 August 1908, the document is unambiguous. The Mount August 26, 1908, at the top of a letter to Fullerton, preserved and published much later. Dear, won't you tell me the meaning of this silence? And she writes, rereading his earlier letters and refusing, on paper, to believe they were insincere. The letter is part of what scholars call her love diary, a private dossier of emotional intelligence kept between 1907 and 1908 and sealed for 30 years after her death. The diary, titled The Life Apart, L'Âme Close, combined journal entries, drafts of letters, and transcriptions of poetry. It was discovered in 1967 by scholars working through her papers at Yale. The existence of the diary remained controversial for decades. Some Wharton scholars argued it was too personal to publish, that it violated her privacy and contradicted the careful public image she had maintained. Others argued it was essential to understanding her emotional life and creative work. It was finally published in full in 2008, a century after it was written. The 26th August letter shows Edith at her most vulnerable. Fullerton has gone silent, not responding to her letters, making excuses when they're supposed to meet. She doesn't yet know that he's entangled with other lovers in Paris, that her letters are piling up unanswered while he manages his complicated romantic life. She still believes the affair is what it seemed at its beginning, a passionate connection between two sophisticated people who understood each other. In the reconstructed drawing room we visit today, docents describe her as a meticulous hostess. In this primary source, we see a woman caught in a different kind of operation, trying to decode another person's silence, weighing the risks of continued attachment against the cost of retreat. The physical setting is not fully described in the letter, but cross-referencing its date with her location and routine. Summers at the Mount, mornings at the desk, afternoons in the gardens and drawing room, lets us place the pages in that carefully arranged interior. She wrote in the morning, usually in her bedroom study, a small room with a view toward the lake. She would have sat at her writing desk, surrounded by books and papers, the light coming through the windows she had positioned for exactly this purpose. It is easy to imagine, but not to state as fact, that she laid the letter beside the same aligned chairs she adjusted before guests arrived. The archival record allows only this: the day, the place, the handwriting, the ache. The drawing room, whether or not it witnessed the writing, remains the frame in which we imagine her doing so. In the museum, visitors study the gilded mirror. In the file, a single line, "Dear, won't you tell me?" reflects a far less stable image. By 1908, medical notes and family correspondence record Teddy Wharton's condition as incurable. his nervous illness increasingly framed as a permanent disability requiring guardianship arrangements. Financial records show erratic spending, including unauthorized withdrawals, that alarm Edith's advisors. Later court papers in 1913 will cite his adultery as well as his instability as grounds for divorce, a rare move for a woman of her social position. The financial situation became critical in 1909, when Edith discovered that Teddy had embezzled approximately $50,000 from her trust fund to buy an apartment in Boston for a mistress. The revelation came through her lawyer and business manager, and it destroyed what little remained of their marriage. Teddy eventually confessed, expressed remorse, and made restitution, but the damage was irreparable. The embezzlement also revealed the extent of Teddy's manic episodes. He'd been spending wildly, making impulsive decisions, and engaging in behavior completely at odds with his previous character. His family consulted neurologists who diagnosed neurasthenia and recommended rest cures and travel. None of the treatments helped. Today, based on documented symptoms, medical historians believe Teddy likely suffered from bipolar disorder and possibly early-onset dementia. At the same time, the Fullerton affair falters. The 26 August 1908 letter marks not the peak of romance but its unraveling, as she pleads for clarity he will not provide. By 1910, it's essentially over. Fullerton has returned to Paris and his various other romantic entanglements. Edith has accepted that he will never offer the kind of committed relationship she had hoped for. The intelligence metaphor tightens. Two targets, one public, a husband whose behavior threatens her emotional and financial stability. One private, a lover whose unreliability erodes her trust, both forcing her to reconsider the house she built as a refuge. We know from her later autobiography, A Backward Glance, published in 1934, that she will omit almost all of this: Teddy's breakdown, Fullerton's betrayal, choosing instead to narrate the Mount primarily as a place of work and friendship. The autobiography devotes barely 3 pages to the Mount, describing it in general terms as a pleasant house where she wrote and entertained friends. Teddy appears only in passing. Fullerton is never mentioned. The emotional turmoil of 1907-1910 is completely erased. That omission becomes, retrospectively, part of the operation, the redaction that keeps the cover story intact. Edith was nothing if not a careful manager of her own narrative. She understood that certain truths, once revealed, could never be controlled again. By leaving them out of her autobiography, she maintained the public image she had constructed, the elegant, successful author whose personal life was as composed as her drawing rooms. The medical files named an illness. The letters described collateral damage the diagnosis could not contain. In 1911, property transfer records show the Mount sold, ending barely a decade of Wharton's formal ownership. Estate inventories detail furniture removed, paintings shipped, books created for Europe. The long drawing room is broken down into line items: pair of gilt armchairs, green damask sofa, marble mantel ornaments. The sale price was $180,000, less than the house had cost to build and furnish. Edith sold it to a group of investors who planned to convert the property into a dormitory for a nearby girls' school. The transaction was handled through her lawyers. She was already in Europe and never returned to see the Mount again. The decision to sell was both practical and symbolic. The Mount had become financially unsustainable. It cost roughly $50,000 per year to maintain and operate, far more than Edith could justify spending on a house she used only part of the year. But the sale also represented the end of an era, the abandonment of the fantasy that had motivated its construction. She had built the Mount as a refuge from an unsatisfying marriage, as a workspace for her writing, as a stage for her social performance. It had failed in all these purposes, or perhaps she had outgrown them. The house that once embodied her design principles becomes, briefly, a problem to be liquidated, an asset tied to a failing marriage, and a husband whose debts and instability she can no longer underwrite. She departs for Europe more permanently, moving her center of gravity toward Paris and then to country houses in Hyères and Saint-Brice-sous-Forêt, where she will later die. The move to Europe was decisive. Edith had always felt more at home in France than in America. She spoke French fluently, preferred European culture and society, and found the American literary scene provincial. After 1911, she spent only brief periods in the United States. She would eventually be buried in France, in the American cemetery at Versailles. In Lenox, the house passes through new owners and, eventually, institutions, starting a long, uneven afterlife of repurposing and neglect. After the school conversion failed, the Mount was sold again in 1912. Over the following decades, it served as a resort hotel, a theater venue, and a private residence. Each use brought modifications, additions, and deterioration. But in the logic of a declassified file, the key entry is simple. 1911. Site abandoned. The environment that once monitored her marriage now becomes an empty shell, its rooms waiting for new occupants who will not know what was staged there. The last act of housekeeping before she leaves reportedly included a final walk through the main floor. Whether she straightened her favorite chair in the drawing room one last time is not in the records. The gap, like so many in her story, is where imagination and evidence stare at each other across a polished floor. The deed book gains a new name. The house quietly loses the only person who knew what it had been enlisted to conceal. In 1913, Edith Wharton secured a divorce from Teddy in a French court, citing his adultery and mental illness, a step so scandalous in her American social world that many early biographical sketches mention it only in passing. Teddy returns to live with his sister in Lenox. Medical and financial guardianship documents mark the end of his independence. The divorce proceedings were handled discreetly in Paris, where the laws were more liberal than in New York. French courts permitted divorce on grounds that American courts would not recognize. Edith presented evidence of Teddy's adultery, the Boston mistress, and his mental incompetence. The court granted the divorce in April 1913, ending 28 years of marriage. The scandal was significant but manageable. Edith was living in France, somewhat insulated from American society's reactions. Her literary success gave her independence. She could support herself through her writing and didn't need to remarry for financial security. Many of her friends and colleagues were supportive, or at least discreet. But some doors were closed. Certain New York drawing rooms would no longer receive her. Some family members distanced themselves. Teddy's subsequent life was sad. He lived with his sister Nancy in Boston under informal guardianship. His mental health continued to deteriorate. He died in 1928 in a sanatorium, having spent the last 15 years of his life largely incapacitated. Edith learned of his death through a telegram. Her response, if recorded, has not survived. Edith settles into her French houses, writes The Age of Innocence, Pulitzer Prize 1921, and publishes her autobiography A Backward Glance in 1934. That memoir, as scholars point out, is notable for what it leaves out. Almost no direct mention of the Fullerton affair, discreet treatment of Teddy's illness, and only partial attention to the years at the Mount. The Age of Innocence is often read as Edith's attempt to come to terms with her American past. Set in 1870s New York, it tells the story of Newland Archer, a man who falls in love with Ellen Olenska, his wife's cousin, but ultimately chooses duty and convention over passion. The novel won the Pulitzer Prize, making Edith the first woman to receive that honor for fiction. A Backward Glance continued the work of narrative control. Published when she was 72, 2 years before her death, it presented the official version of her life. The prose is elegant, controlled, revealing nothing she didn't want revealed. The years 1907-1913, the affair, the divorce, the emotional turmoil, are compressed into brief, bland paragraphs. The Mount appears as a pleasant interlude, nothing more. It is, in effect, an official narrative, the version that would sit at the front of a file, framing the rest of the documents for future readers. The drawing room in Lenox has long since been repainted and refurnished by others. In her pages it appears mostly as a backdrop for productive writing, not as the chamber where she sat with letters from a lover who no longer replied. The intelligence analyst reading across archives sees the shape of the omission. The architect of proportion and symmetry extends the same control to memory. Some chairs are left in the picture, others quietly removed. On the shelf, A Backward Glance looks complete. In the locked collections at Yale and elsewhere, the missing pages still alter its balance. By the 1970s, photographs and reports show the Mount in serious disrepair. peeling stucco, leaking roofs, overgrown gardens, after decades of institutional use and neglect. Shakespeare and Company, the theater troupe founded by Tina Packer, uses the site as a performance space. Actors later tell reporters they believed the house was haunted, some claiming to have seen a male figure or felt the presence of Wharton herself in certain rooms. The haunting stories were specific. Actors rehearsing late at night reported seeing a woman in white moving through the upper floors. Others felt sudden drops in temperature in the drawing room. A male figure in early 20th century clothing was supposedly seen in the library. The stories persisted even among skeptical performers, becoming part of the Mount's folklore. Whether the hauntings were genuine or the product of suggestion and atmosphere is impossible to determine. What's clear is that the house retained an emotional charge, a sense of unfinished business that even strangers could feel. The rooms where Edith had struggled with her marriage, written her books, and conducted her secret affair seemed to retain some imprint of those dramas. In 1971, the estate was declared a National Historic Landmark, one of the few dedicated to a woman. The designation recognized the Mount's architectural significance and its association with an important American writer. It also helped preserve the property by attracting attention and eventually funding for restoration. Fundraising campaigns and preservation reports from the 1990s-2000s document emergency stabilization, historically accurate repainting, and the painstaking recreation of the drawing room using period photographs, inventories, and Wharton's own design principles. The restoration was complicated and expensive. Decades of alterations and neglect had obscured the house's original appearance. Researchers worked with fragmentary evidence, a few early photographs, inventory lists, Wharton's writings on decoration, to reconstruct what the rooms had looked like in 1902-1911. The drawing room restoration was particularly challenging. Paint analysis revealed multiple layers of colors from different periods. Conservators had to determine which represented Wharton's original choices. Furniture had been scattered or destroyed. Researchers tracked down period pieces similar to what she would have owned, using estate inventories and photographs to guide their selections. Chairs are once again placed in matched pairs, a sofa anchored under a mirror, sightlines restored between fireplace and terrace doors. Restoration staff talk about bringing the house back to the way Edith intended, using her dictum on proportion and symmetry as a guiding rule. The file has shifted from surveillance to conservation. The house is now evidence rather than an instrument. Still, when volunteers straighten a slightly misaligned chair before opening the room for tours, they reenact, without knowing it, a gesture that once concealed far more than dust. The preservation reports speak of paint colors and plaster. The ghost. Stories insist there is something else in the room that cannot be patched. Today, brochures and websites describe the Mount as a cultural center that celebrates the intellectual, artistic, and humanitarian legacy of Edith Wharton, noting that she designed the house and gardens with the same intelligence and sensitivity that distinguishes her writing. Tours of the main house typically move through the arched gallery, dining room, and drawing room, where guides point out the symmetry, the sightlines, and the careful balance of whites and greens. The Mount now operates as both museum and cultural center, hosting literary events, workshops, and performances. The organization has expanded beyond simple house tours to become a destination for scholars and general visitors interested in literature, design, and Gilded Age history. Some mention Teddy's illness and the eventual divorce, though usually in brief, and allude to personal turmoil during the years she wrote The House of Mirth and Ethan Frome here. Tour guides handle this material delicately, respecting both historical truth and the sensibilities of visitors who may not want to dwell on painful details. The emphasis remains on Edith's achievements, her design vision, her literary success, her cultural impact. Recent essays and blog posts by visitors read the house more explicitly as a feminist statement, equal parts architecture reverie and manifesto of a brilliant woman constrained by Gilded Age society, as one writer puts it. This interpretation has gained traction in recent decades, as feminist scholarship has reclaimed Wharton as not just a great writer, but also as a woman who navigated patriarchal constraints with intelligence and determination. Academic work on her love diary and correspondence with Fullerton, James, and others has added new layers to the interpretive script, framing the Mount as a site of emotional awakening as well as marital breakdown. The publication of the Life Apart diary in 2008 was a watershed, revealing aspects of Edith's emotional life that previous generations of scholars could only speculate about. Yet even these readings depend on persistent blanks. We still do not know precisely which conversations took place in the drawing room, what words were said on evenings when chairs were inched closer together or pushed apart. The room functions now like an intelligence photograph released with sections blacked out, enough visible to suggest the rest, just enough missing to keep the viewer unsettled. Every tour gives visitors more context. The silences in the script continue to do their own quieter work. On a clear fall morning in the present, the main tour has just ended. The last visitors step out onto the long terrace to look toward Laurel Lake and the line of neighboring estates. In the drawing room, the air smells faintly of dust, fabric, and fresh paint. A staff member walks through with a checklist, lights off, shutters set, rope barriers. Straight, and pauses by a pair of armchairs near the fireplace. One is a few centimeters off the axis. Without thinking, they put a hand on the carved wood and ease the chair back into line, aligning it with the rug's pattern and the mirror above the mantel. The movement is small, almost unconscious, a routine gesture learned from training sessions about respecting Wharton's design. The training is thorough. Staff and volunteers study Wharton's writings on decoration, learn about period furniture placement, and practice the kind of careful observation that maintains the room's integrity. They're taught to notice small disturbances, a chair out of line, a cushion compressed, a rope barrier sagging, and to correct them immediately. The goal is to keep the room looking as it would have in 1902-1911, always ready for Edith's inspection. Somewhere in a nearby vitrine, a copy of The Decoration of Houses lies open to the chapter on drawing rooms, the line about proportion reproduced on a wall panel. In the archives off-site, a carbon copy of the 1911 sale document notes the day the house left her ownership. In a climate-controlled box at another institution, the August 1908 letter from the Mount sits under acid-free paper. These documents are scattered across multiple institutions: Yale's Bynecka Library, the Lilly Library at Indiana University, the Edith Wharton collection at Mount Holyoke College. Researchers must travel or request digital scans, piecing together the story from fragments held in different hands. No single archive contains the complete record of what happened in this house. The person straightening the chair does not need to know any of this. The room's symmetry closes over the gesture as it has closed over many others. The file, once classified, is now dispersed across institutions and tourist brochures, but its central tension remains: a woman who designed a room to be perfectly balanced and a life that never was. In the log for the day, someone initials the checklist next to "drawing room in order." The record, as usual, says nothing about what it costs to keep it that way. Late in the afternoon, after the last tour, the house settles. From the terrace, the view down the hill toward the other houses on the Berkshire Ridge is still unmistakably hierarchical. The Mount continues to look down. A breeze comes off Laurel Lake and pushes against the terrace doors. One, not fully latched, opens just enough to let a line of cold air slip along the floor into the drawing room. On the far wall, a single chair, the one nearest the terrace, shifts a fraction of an inch on its felt pad with a soft scrape that no one hears. The room holds its breath. Outside, the lawns fall away toward a landscape that long ago absorbed the scandal of a broken marriage. Inside, the balanced space waits in the dimming light, every chair aligned for a conversation that has already happened and cannot be replayed.